Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. It's a privilege and honor to be able to present today with all of my colleagues in the most unfortunate circumstances, I think, and yet in the most inspiring way that we're all able to come together. My name is David Breifman. I work at the Jewish Education Project. Many people have asked why we, a 100-year-old organization, has even decided that we should be doing a webinar like this today. And in many ways, I think the response of over 400 people to come onto this webinar is signal in and of itself. But even more importantly, I think for an organization that has declared that thriving is a means in which someone can be the most successful person that they can be in the world, we need to also understand that in order to be able to thrive, one also needs to be able to survive. And in that way, we take stock today of what happened 2 weeks ago in Parkland, Florida, to be able to remember, come together, and to respond in a way as a Jewish community believes we should be able to do so. I do want to say from the outset that a webinar is only just that, a webinar. We know we can't change everything today, but may today begin to be the start of our journey together and independently to be able to bring about change in the world in order to make it a better place. Directly following this webinar, we will have resources online for all of you to access. We'll put up a link inside the chat box now and moving forward for you to reflect upon, to add to contribute to as we move forward. When we decided to run this webinar, we were overwhelmed. Over 400 people registered almost immediately, and 14 organizations came on as sponsors, and I'd like to name them all because I think they're all part of this equation with us today. We have with us on this call organizational representation from BBYO, the Foundation for Jewish Camp, Habonim Dror, JCCA, Jewish Teen Funders Network, J-Teen Leadership, Moving Traditions, Prisma, the Brompen Fellowship, URJ Nifty, USY, Young Judea, and of course, our sponsors, UJA Federation of New York, who all help make this and all of our work possible. We're privileged today to come together on Ta'anit Esther, the fast of Esther as well, a day when we recall the heroism of one person who led many to stand against tyranny. And in that way, we also acknowledge that today's webinar has a dual focus. Firstly, that we will take time to, as youth educators and professionals in the field, and learn what we can do in times like these, and help and support one another. And then we'll also transition as the call moves on to talk about how we can support our students to rise and take action when they best see fit. Just to get everybody familiar with some of the technology that we're using today, all of the participants are muted both visually and by sound. If you have a question to ask of one of the panelists, we'll do our best to answer them, but please put those questions in the Q&A section, which you can find at the top of your screen. You should also feel free to chat to one another at any stage during this webinar, and I might encourage you all to get familiar with that aspect of this webinar technology by just writing in the chat right now which city you're logging in from. Where are you joining us from, so we can get a sense of where all of you are today. If at any stage during the webinar you're having some problem, then you can go to the chat function and you can send a direct message to Tech Help, and we'll do our best to answer you. And of course, this webinar will also be available upon completion later on today for all of you to download at any stage. I do want to say one thing before we get started with our esteemed panel, and that is that all education, I believe, is political. Inherent in every decision we make as educators are choices that we make that bring our worldviews to the fore. But I do want to say that for the purposes of today, we're going to avoid as much as possible getting into the actual politics surrounding gun control and gun violence in today's schools, and really try and get to the issues that are affecting our people right now. Of course, if people want to raise those issues, we can, but I'll say it quite simply. The major driving force behind our webinar today is that we can all work together to ensure that our children are protected, to keep our children safe, and to support them when they need us most. On today's webinar, we are joined by Simon Klarfeld, the Executive Director of Young Judea, Rabbi Melissa Zalman-Stolman, the Director of Lifelong Learning at Congregation Kol Tikva in Parkland, Florida. Betsy Stone, a psychologist and adjunct lecturer at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. And Sarah Lynn Lerner, a high school senior at West Boca High School in Florida. I'm going to hand over to each of these speakers to present. Anytime you have questions, we'll send them through to us in the Q&A function, and I'll do my best to try and answer as many of them or direct them as best we can. But without further ado, I'd like to start us off by introducing to you Melissa, who has been on the ground in Parkland, Florida, servicing the youth, the families, and the educators in that region. Thank you, Melissa.
Hi, everyone. I'm really honored to be a part of our panel today. I wish it were for different reasons. Obviously, I think everybody does. For those of you who know me, you know I'm a pretty high energy, happy kind of person, like 24/7. And you'll hear my voice today and probably see on my face this sort of sadness, drained energy, kind of feeling a little lost, and that's sort of the temperature in Parkland, Florida right now. I live in a place where every time I would go to a conference and it had my name on it and then underneath it says Parkland, Florida, people would say, "Oh, where is that?" And I'd always have to say, "It's 10 minutes south of Boca. Have you been to Boca?" It was this place that was just never on the map for anyone. And the people who lived here really loved that because it's sort of this quiet oasis. It is listed as one of the safest towns in Florida. And in fact, it might have been just recently listed the safest town in Florida before everything happened 2 weeks ago. And people who live here, a lot of them are transplants. Not many people grew up in Parkland. It's a pretty new planned community. People who live here move here because the public school system is rated so highly. So most people who are in town send their kids to one of 3 elementary schools. There is 1 middle school and then 1 high school. And the middle school and the high school are directly next door to one another. And there are about 2 major streets, and I use major loosely because one of them has like roundabouts on it, not even traffic lights all the way down. And the high school is on one street and the congregation is a mile up the road on the other street near the intersection of Holmberg, which is the street where Douglas is located. So again, tiny town, 31,000 families. Our congregation is a small Reform congregation, 345 families. The only other really established congregations here are the Chabad, or an unaffiliated congregation that meets at a dance studio and at one of the schools. And because of the nature of the community, it is a very young congregation, meaning that homes are still being built here. It sort of used to be the Everglades and people only saw wildlife here, and the Everglades have been filled in a little bit, and the communities are still being built, and it attracts a lot of young families. So with only 345 families, we service about 430 children in the course of 1 week between our preschool, our kindergarten through 6th grade religious school program, and our 7th through 12th grade high school, middle school, and high school programs. We have 63 teens who are registered in our high school programs, and that's not including teens who might be involved in other places like BBYO, but their families are still members here. So that's probably like another 20 or so. And I would say about 90% of those teens attend Douglas because it's the only high school in town. If they don't attend that high school, that means they go to private school, but they're not, we're not a congregation that feeds in from a bunch of places. So I wanted to give you a picture of the community. It's called Parkland for a reason. It's because there are tons of parks around. And if any of you have looked at the images of not just in front of the school, but the crosses and the Jewish stars that are centered in the middle of a park, that is the park where this whole town comes to congregate all the time. All the kids are in Little League, which is just starting up, in soccer, which is just ending, and that's the place with all the fields. And where all those memorials are right now is where this community comes together on a Saturday night for Eats and Beats, which is our concert series with food trucks. So we are all shaken to the core. Everyone either knows someone who was in school that day, has a child that was in school that day. All our children will be in that school one day. There are family members at our congregation who lost loved ones, teachers in our congregation. So everybody has been touched by what happened here. And our town is so small that every time there's a siren that goes through or the helicopters that are still hovering overhead, typically you go on social media, why is there a fire truck in town? Why is there this in town? And now we're getting a little bit used to it and a little bit annoyed, wishing that it would sort of allow the kids to have a little semblance of normalcy. So that's sort of a snapshot of where we are. I was asked to be on today, obviously to tell you about that, but to tell you about some of the things that we've been offering our teens and our students. And David, feel free to cut me off when I use up too much of my time. But right now, people are very confused. It's still very fresh, and everyone's in shock. And a lot of places have been wanting to set up grief counselors, and we're still sort of in crisis and trauma. Not everyone's moved to the stage of grief yet. Dr. Betsy Stone is really the expert in that. But I will just tell you from what I've been hearing, the teens are still, afraid to sleep in their own rooms, afraid to go to school, afraid to go to the bathroom. There's a lot of stuff going on, and they don't know when it's going to hit them. They'll say, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine, and then something will happen and they'll get upset. So as a community and as a congregation, it's really been our role to make sure that we are here, that we are open all the time, and that we have people here who can meet with our families and our teens. And not just the teens' families, but younger kids are totally affected by what's been going on, and the parents don't know how to talk to their kids. Do I tell them what happened? Do I not? How much detail do I go into? Or I keep crying in front of my child, and my child's now acting out because of that. So there's a lot of issues starting to manifest for everybody. And we've had mental health professionals here on the site from that Wednesday. I mean, once we sort of got through the initial, okay, there's a shooting going on, let's call every kid, let's text every kid, let's go look at their Snapchats, let's see if they're safe, where are they, let's text the parents and find out, is everyone safe? Even though we were on lockdown at the same time, our preschoolers were all hiding in bathrooms, because when there's an active shooter on the loose, the whole town goes on lockdown. We would only open our doors to the teens who ran here as a safe haven, because we're only a mile up the road. And when you run and you want to go somewhere that you know is safe and will protect you, thankfully, a lot of them thought to come here and to bring their friends here. So it's hard to believe that.
I'm going to thank Melissa for setting the scene for what's taken place in Parkland, and particularly in her congregation. We thought it was a very important way to frame what's happening today, not to lose sight of the fact that we're not talking in the abstract. We're talking about real people, real students, real rabbis, real clergy, real youth professionals. And that for us, not just to take that moment to take stock for ourselves that this is happening, we need to actually understand and appreciate the real suffering that's going on before we transition so quickly into the meta understanding. And Betsy's going to start Dr. Betsy Stone is going to start providing the context from a psychologist's perspective on how we deal with these issues. But having that as a framing, thank you to Rabbi Melissa for sharing those opening words. I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Betsy Stone.
Hello, everybody, and good afternoon. I'd like to ask you all to take a moment, go back to the chat box, and write in the chat box kind of where your head is at, how you're feeling. I think it's important for us to know how we feel, because until I know how I feel, my feelings get in the way of my learning and my thinking. Our anxiety, if we don't articulate it, ends up standing between me and what I can do. And so I want us all to spend a minute and take our own feelings, validate them, and understand that they're just as important as everything else we're doing, and they will get in the way of your learning. That is true for us. It is true for our teenagers. It is true for their parents. If you know what you feel, you can actually think more easily, and your feelings may not be in your way quite as much. So our traditional understandings of grief kind of arise in three arenas: physical behavior, emotional behavior, and spiritual behavior. What we see in typical grief, and this is actually not typical grief, is changes in physical behavior, in eating and sleeping and sexual behavior. It's not always that we do less of them. Sometimes we actually do more of them. So it's any shift in those kinds of behavior with, of course, a sense of depression or sorrow that's pretty normal in grief. Changes in emotional behavior. People get tearful, people get numb. Numb is self-protective, and there's nothing wrong with it. When we get numb, what it actually does is it's putting us on hold for another time when we're going to feel things. And people get explosive. Explosiveness is actually a pretty typical response to grief. And spiritual changes. There is no way for somebody who's on a spiritual journey not to ask questions about what God is up to. How could God permit this? How could God do this? Is there even a God? At the same time that we have those traditional manifestations of grief, all of this is changed by social media. Because what happens with social media is that we get messages about what we're supposed to be feeling. We are supposed to be angry, we are supposed to be tearful, we're supposed to be motivated, we're supposed to be acting. And so one of the things that happens as a result of social media, and this also can happen as a result of individual conversations, is that what I feel gets measured by what I'm told I'm supposed to feel. And sometimes we actually mute ourselves because what we are feeling is not what we are told we're supposed to be feeling. Another piece of this is that this is a communal trauma, much like September 11th, much like Sandy Hook, much like Columbine. Communal trauma actually builds communal responses. What it doesn't do is make the individual response not happen. So despite the fact that there is a communal response, each of us is also having individual responses. Our kids are activated by the communal response. The communal response is the thing that says, march now, write now, tweet now. But what that does not do is mean that my personal responses aren't also occurring. There is a New York Times article, which I think somebody's going to put up in the chat room, so you'll be able to access it, about what is happening for kids at night or when they're alone. Thank you, Rachel, that speaks to the fact that these kids who are really out there trying to change the world, and thank God, are also weeping and unable to sleep and feeling sick and not eating or eating too much, and having all those individual grief responses as well as this wonderful political outpouring. So that one of the things we have to be aware of is that our kids who are becoming activists almost overnight are also mourners and grievers and frightened. And it's not just the kids in Parkland, and it's not even just the kids in Florida. All of our kids are having both of those experiences, the communal and the personal. Another issue that we see that comes up for us around these kind of communal events and around personal grief is the question of when I'm allowed to laugh again. This is a really hard question for all of us. when something bad happens in our lives, when do we get to smile? Well, the reality is that our bodies and our psyches are really good at working towards recovery. Humans are built to recover. That is who we are. And so we do begin to laugh, and we do begin to smile, and we do make stupid jokes, and we do engage in our lives again. That's a really important thing for us to know, and for us to let our kids know that it is okay, even after a tragedy, even after a horror, for people to get up in the morning and smile. One of the things we know about adults is that there is a very not atypical response to coming home from a funeral, which is that people have sex after funerals. Why? Because we are built to live, and we are built to recover. So one of the things I think we have to do despite the fact that we're grieving, is we have to also understand that we are recovering. We are changing as a result of what's happened, but we are recovering. So in terms of what you all need, I want to suggest to you that the first thing you need, and I think Melissa would agree with this completely, is you need to know ahead of time what your resources are. You need to know who you can call in a crisis. And that may be an individual, it may be an organization, depending on your town, it may be a JFS, it may be a child guidance clinic, it may be individuals that that in an emergency, these are the people that you can turn to who will show up. And that is both for the kids and for you. One of the things that we know, and one of the things I've been kind of bugging Melissa about since Valentine's Day, what a weird day, is that those of us who are on the front lines have to really work hard to make sure we do self-care. And self-care for each of us is something different. For Melissa, it is turning her phone off at night. That's a really important thing to be able to do, to say, I need to recharge, because you can't keep going into the fray unless you recharge. And you need to recharge in whatever ways work for you. So understand there is a concept in psychology that is called secondary trauma. It is the trauma of hearing other people's trauma or being present for other people's trauma. And it also demands recovery. So if you're doing your job well, you also need to have people you can lean on. One of the things that I had great faith that Melissa did was to create a safe space. One of the biggest concepts in creating a safe space is that you listen and don't solve. Nobody is coming to you and asking you what they should do. Even if they say that, what they're really asking you is, will you witness my pain? And witnessing other people's fear and pain is actually holy work. It took me a long time to understand that the best thing I can do for somebody who's in pain is be present. The best thing you can do for somebody who's in pain is be present. One of the things we do for our children when they're afraid is we sit on their beds and we rub their backs. We're not taking anything away. We're adding something. So I want you to think about what you give and what you receive and what you need, so that you can be present and pay the cost of this holy work, but pay the cost in a way which is manageable for you. Okay, David, I stayed under 10 minutes, I think.
Thank you very much, Betsy. So I do want to just to orient ourselves to saying that this original webinar went out primarily to those of us in the community who work with teenagers, youth professionals, in the broader sense of the word. And we know that so many more of you have joined this call who work well beyond that profession. And I do want to say that it's important for us to acknowledge that we don't expect you to have all of the answers and all the capacities and capabilities to deal with all of the issues that your young people are bringing towards you. In fact, I think we're suggesting almost the opposite, that what your part of your job is to at least know the warning signs and to have with you the list of people in your community who can be your support, and you can direct where you need to direct to. It's truly at moments like these when we recognize and need to realize more than ever that it takes a whole village. And in this way, the village is the community which we've established, and we're not putting the extra burden on you, but at least giving you the sense of responsibility, if not obligation, to know who is it that you can turn to. And I think one of the proactive measures that you all can take as a result of what's taken place in the last couple of weeks is to begin to develop your own resource list. Who are the people, and often they're in your own community, who you can turn to? Unfortunately, crises like this, we believe they're going to happen again. And it might not be this type, but there'll be something where you'll need to access those people. So I think Betsy's call to look after yourselves and to look after your children, your youth, is really important. And then also to start being proactive here. So something remarkable has taken place in the last 2 weeks. And it's something that, for those of us who have worked with teenagers for a long time, are just beginning to get our heads around in many ways. Like, for a long time, people like myself and others have known that youth and young people have the power to change the world. And in my own work, I cite all of these examples of those who fought in the civil rights movement, or those who fought up in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, or those who fought against the war in Vietnam, or to free Soviet Jewry. The truth is that in most of those mobilization efforts, the people leading the charge were actually like in their 20s, or they were a bit older. They were college-age students and above. And this is perhaps one of the first times in history, at least in recent history, where it's actually teenagers, people who are still supposed to be in school, who are actually leading a change effort. And this is remarkable in and of itself. And it's not just about the technology. And for those of you who think they're only able to do so because they've got the ability to tweet, I think are missing what's taking place before our very eyes. And I think that's the second part of the transition for this call, which is important, is what do we do as youth professionals or people working with teenagers when the kids are leading the charge? And what does it take from us to actually empower them to do so? What does it mean for our role in this work, knowing that we might not be all the answers here. In fact, we might be secondary. And I think we're seeing here a possible transition in what is the role of the Jewish youth professional when it comes to relating to young people today. And no better person to speak on this topic is Simon Klarfeld, the Executive Director from Young Judea, who's had many experiences in both activism and mobilization efforts before, and also involved with one of the premier youth organizations in North America today. So I'm going to hand over to Simon.
Thank you, David, and thank you everyone for facilitating this really, really important webinar. I do want to begin by acknowledging what David has just talked about, which is this is a unique opportunity without sounding opportunistic. It is a unique opportunity for us in the Jewish community in particular to not only prove our relevance as a community, but to actually inspire and to be inspired throughout this process. I've looked at the list of all of the emotions that people wrote down in response to Betsy's beautiful comments earlier on. And an overarching theme for me is this real double feeling of grief, anger, fear on the one hand, totally, of course, understandable and natural, and inspiration, call for action, seeing the amazing potential in our youth as champions of change on the other. And I think that tension is something that we need to really hold, not only throughout this conversation, but throughout our lives as Jewish educators.
Simon, can I just, sorry, 1 second, sorry. Are you able just to pull the microphone slightly away from your mouth and speak up just a bit louder?
Sorry.
Much better, thank you.
So without repeating myself, I would just say that I think this tension between recognizing the very negative place that we're in, as well as the inspiration and the call to action that we have ahead of us, is something that is a real vehicle for us as community organizers, as community inspirers, and as mentors to the next generation coming up through the ranks to be that next generation of educators. So the first question I have is there something unique about the role of Jewish youth educators in this work? A couple of my colleagues actually asked me, so you're going on this webinar, is there anything specific? This doesn't only affect Jews, this clearly isn't only a Jewish issue. What is it that we specifically can bring? And I think for me that there are two different elements here that are uniquely Jewish contributions to this. The first is that we have organizations, that we have institutions, that we have community, that people turn to at times of need and times of need for change. And it's therefore up to us as stewards of those organizations and institutions that are uniquely Jewish to be able to mobilize, to be able to test the waters, to be able to bring consensus, to be able to bring individuals at very different places through a process of which they can feel one as a community. I think the second thing is clearly, as we think about the educational processes that we may want to engage our youth in, that is not only around, do you want to do something with your feelings? We have so much of an abundance of Jewish values and traditions that speak to the situation that we're in today. David mentioned Purim from the offset, from the get-go. Obviously, tonight we're actually going to be celebrating confusion and the turning of the world upside down, not to know the difference between good and bad, and how do we deal with that? Well, what a better vehicle by which to have a conversation with kids today about other things that they're feeling in a world that is upside down for them. Values of justice and injustice, clearly tzedek, tikkun olam, those values are critical to educate people among and see that there is real meaning and relevance to our Jewish traditions and our Jewish values here. But community for me is the core value that I think we really need to be focusing on, and it's not so easy. I want to throw a slight wrench in the works of thinking that everything we're going to be doing is, should I say, going to be embraced by all. Anything that is not only political with a small p, but also dealing with numerous people from numerous communities in very, very different mindsets is going to be very, very challenging to bring people along as a single community. And it's really important to recognize that some are needing to grieve, others are needing to raise theological questions, others are wanting action. People are wanting to do different things. And one of the learnings that I've had over the last couple of weeks of working directly with teens and college students around these issues is that there is such a huge desire from this generation of teens to have consensus. They're feeling enormous, enormous divisiveness within the society, political divisiveness, anything's a lightning rod for debate. And many of the teen leaders that I've been working with are concerned of creating a single path of moving forward that may leave others behind because of either disagreement or that they're not ready yet for those things. And I want to really recognize as a facilitator, as a group educator, that not everyone is in the same place, and we need to figure out ways in which either we can bring everyone on the same page and move everyone along, or recognize that there are multiple pathways, gateways, and entry points into these conversations and points of action. So the educational process is one of community building in and of itself. Consensus is a big question. How do we understand the issues and various responses? How do we understand that while it's relatively easy to advocate, the solutions are in fact extremely complex with numerous implications? How do we not shut down the simple answers that many of us feel that we have in dealing with issues that need change, but at the same time recognize nuance and recognize the frustration that change is inevitably going to have, because there will always be resistance to change. And the slogan of "You and I can change the world," which by the way is a great slogan of Young Judea for many, many years, has to be more than a simple slogan. It needs to be one that we teach and educate and train around, that there are skills around which you can analyze the problems of the world, in which you can share different viewpoints of how that world can be changed, and then to go out and be part of the solution of changing the world for the better. So what does that better society look like? What is the teens' vision? What are some Jewish and prophetic visions that may be inspiring or challenging for them to look at? And then to the question of empowerment itself. I'd like to put up this slide here as a representation of a number of ideas. And this is one of many variations of this particular image. It's called the ladder of participation, or the ladder of empowerment. And it may seem obvious to us all, especially those working with teens, working with youth, that the bottom part of this ladder are the ways in which we don't engage, and in fact the way we disengage our teens and our youth, by what I would say is the adults running the show. This is not your place as teens, you're just kids. We know what to do, follow us, and we will lead the way. At the top end of the ladder, there is, however, the potential of a different kind of danger in its extreme. And I'll give you one example that I'd like to share with you from when I was a Hillel director. I came to a campus of incredible high affiliated Jews. They were empowered, the students were empowered enormously to make the decisions of what the program of Hillel and therefore Jewish life on campus was to be like. And I asked the question in my first year, what are we doing for a Passover Seder? And the staff turned around to me and said, well, typically we don't do a Passover Seder. And I said, so why would we not do a Passover Seder? And they said, well, the leaders go home. The student leaders go back home, and therefore they don't see the need for themselves to have a Passover Seder. I said, but our responsibility is not to simply empower. Our responsibility is also to build and provide for the community. And therefore, the empowerment model has to be one in which there is an incredibly active role for the youth educator, for the adult to play. It may not be very visible. It may not be very frontal and leadership oriented, but it is very present in the way in which we guide, in the way in which we provide support, in the way in which we provide counsel, in the way in which when a team leader makes a mistake, we are there to help and to catch them and to mentor them and train them to do it better, and so on and so forth. So the empowerment model, I would warn people of the extremes of either case, but it is absolutely critically important that our role is to support the teens in their quest for turning their power that they have into the change that they see in the world. And how do we do that? We do that through a number of ways, through
Okay, we seem to have lost Simon. Can you hear me? Okay, Simon, we seem to have lost your volume. I'm going to pick up and then chime in to see if you come back in. So I'm going to just try and preempt what Simon was going to say in the different ways that we can engage our teens. And I think one of the most important Jewish concepts here is almost the act of tzimtzum, of actually withdrawing within ourselves to be able to give the teens that space. If we get Simon's volume back on, we'll get him back on board. But what I'm going to do now is transition and take heed of what how Simon just left off with us, and pick up here by saying that we thought long and hard, given that given all of what we're talking about in the second half of this webinar is about empowering teen voices, is how do we actually give teens that voice on the webinar today? The immediate reaction from us would have been to invite one of the eloquent students from Parkland to come and speak today. And we decided against that, partly because those students are so prominent already and that so many of us have heard their voices in the media already, and they are having a very prominent voice in the discourse. And primarily because we didn't want to have to, on this call, deal with the raw emotional grief that so many of them are still going through. And that being said, we know that so many other students around the country are being mobilized by what's taken place over the last 2 weeks. So we're really pleased to be able to introduce to you Sarah Lynn Lerner, who lives in Florida as well. She's an active member in BBYO youth organization, a high school senior who's really taken up the charge to mobilize and to hear from one of our youth voices what it takes to actually become an activist today. We're going to hand over to Sarah Lynn. So I'll just ask Simon to go back onto mute and Sarah Lynn to come off mute. And thank you very much. So Sarah Lynn, thank you.
Hi everyone. Like David said, my name is Sarah Lynn Lerner. I'm 18 years old and I'm a high school senior at West Boca Raton High School. I want to start off my presentation by saying that right now, in the wake of this horror and this terrorism, for lack of a better word, instead of deciding how to survive college, my friends and I are currently deciding how to survive. So just to put that into perspective, we aren't fighting the people who are fighting the power of us. We are fighting and we're fighting for our safety. I noticed that I have terrible connection. How can I change that?
Keep going, just speak loudly, Sarah Lynn.
Okay, so I want to highlight and there's a difference between mobilizing and mobilizing, being on this call, and to the ground. I would just like to, say thank you. Most importantly, what I have been approaching the situation as is with peace, because peaceful protesting bears the most fruit, which you can see from Martin Luther King Jr. which is just one example. But a lot of the times, students don't know what to get involved in, and that seems to be the problem with my school and a lot of the communities in Florida. There are too many things to get involved with, so people don't know exactly what to follow. This is one of the reasons that we're having this webinar, and that we'll have the link of resources so you can directly find what's closest to you and what's most convenient to you. I wanted to talk about how I personally was able to galvanize and mobilize teenagers at my school. My high school, West Boca, is 10 miles away from Douglas. And during everything that was going on, Melissa said that her child was locked in her synagogue with a teacher. Meanwhile, I was texting my friends that were hiding in closets. So there's no words to put into, where the teens that went through that, where they're at mentally right now. The only thing that we're focusing on as a movement, as teenagers, is getting back to school and staying safe. So to talk about that, I wanted to mention some of the things that Dr. Betsy Stone and Simon and Rabbi Melissa went over. One thing that Dr. Betsy Stone, was that students are becoming activists overnight. And truly, there's no other words besides incredible, because our generation is plagued with being lazy and, putting things off, but everyone knows someone that has been impacted by this. And these teenagers, these 15, 16, 17-year-olds, they're standing up for the things they believe in. They're putting their lives at risk so they can help other children keep stay safe while they're at school. So yes, students are becoming activists overnight, but I also think it's important to highlight the students that have been activists for previous political movements and other peaceful protests. So while there are the activists that are coming out overnight, we should still be encouraging and mobilizing the ones who have taken stances on such great issues before. Another thing I wanted to talk about was the fact that Dr. Stone said, when should we smile right away? Obviously, it's been 2 weeks now since the shooting occurred, and my school was back in session the day after the shooting. Nobody wanted to smile. Nobody wanted to talk about it, but that's how we're going to solve this. You know, the main thing is that we start the conversation. And so that's, in a nutshell, the best way to mobilize and to galvanize your teens is by having a conversation. You know, creating a movement and taking action in a movement does not mean that you have to throw a boulder into the water. Throwing a pebble into a water and throwing a boulder into a water, they still make ripples. And so the best thing that you can do is, instead of just simply empowering your teens and allowing them to do the things that they have been asking, like these marches and these sit-outs and these walkouts and these protests, actually take part in them. You, as Jewish educators, you are the people that taught us how to fight for the things that we believed in, whether you're our teachers, whether you're our rabbis, whether you are a cantor at our synagogues. We looked up to you. It's your generation that put these ideas in our head of how we can, you know, use our own voices. And we're doing exactly that, but we need your help, because a generation of teenagers, as much as I'd like to hope that we could, we're not taking over the world. We're starting a movement, and every movement has its leaders. Every movement has its followers. And on this movement, the Jewish educators, you are nothing other than the educators, but you also are the leaders of this. You're telling us, you know, since we were kids, that we need to stand up for ourselves, that we need to speak for ourselves, that we need to protect, need to, you know, respond to one another. You showed us that way, and the only way that these peaceful protests and that change is going to happen is if you keep showing us those right ways.
Sarah Lynn, are you able to just mention briefly the sit-in which you started at the school?
Right, yes. So, I got sidetracked, but like I said, through BBYO and my leadership roles, I attended 2 summer leadership programs over the summer with BBYO, and I also served on the regional board for a third of programming of Jewish teens in Florida. And obviously that's given me a pretty strong voice. I also have been active in student government as my school, as the president for my freshman, sophomore, and junior years. So I would consider myself someone that's an activist that didn't occur overnight. I like to make my voice heard. My parents like to say that I have a very strong mind, but I like to mobilize others aside from just empowering them. So at my school, on Tuesday, after the shooting, there had been talks and discussions of possibly walking out. But online, apparently, if you were to walk out of school, you could get charged with truancy. Now, being 18 and being on government property and thinking about college, none of my friends, none of my classmates, none of us wanted to get arrested for standing up for people that no longer could stand up for themselves. So instead, we approached the policemen that were securing our school, as well as our principal, and we asked them, what can we do that will make a difference, that won't cause a problem? So they told us if we kept everyone on campus, that there will be no problem. There's full administrative support, and there is full protection of the students. So hand in hand, I sat with my principal, Mr. Summer, and a cop from Boca Raton. We sat on the floor of the courtyard in silence 5 minutes before the bell rang. As students came out, they started running. They were looking at us confused, like like mentioned before by the other panelists, social media was the biggest player in this. I posted a picture hugging police officers and my principal saying, everyone come to the courtyard, please sit silent. And so we did. Once 2,000 so students were in the courtyard, I stood up in front of them and I asked a favor if they could take 17 minutes of silence for each of the 17 victims. And so we did. So 2,000 plus students from my school, along with teachers, staff, policemen, and some parents, as long as news vans and helicopters even showed up. And together we sat in silence and we made our difference. Eventually it turned into a walkout. But like I said before, whether it was the walkout, which is the boulder, or whether it's the sit in silence and remembrance, which is the pebble, we were still making a difference. And that's how you mobilize, and that's how you galvanize teens to get them onto the path to getting the things that we need to keep our students safe.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah Lynn, for sharing. And as you can see, the comments that are coming up, please encourage people to, if you have questions to ask of any of our panelists, I'd encourage you to do so. There are some coming through. I'm going to direct a few questions now to some of the panelists specifically. One of the questions that's come up quite a lot in discussions has been about age appropriateness. A lot of us deal in institutions, synagogues, where we've got preschool kids and we've got middle school kids and high school kids and college-age kids and adults, and we've got everybody. But at what age do you start talking to your children about this, especially in the climate we live in when they are exposed to this at such various ages? And I'm wondering, Betsy, if you'd like to just comment on some of, I know there's no right or wrong answer here, but just give us some guidance as people in this field as the age issue related to this information.
Great question. It's a question we always used to raise about Holocaust education as well. And my feeling on it is quite simply, if the kids are going to hear about it anywhere, you want them to hear about it first from you. So that the answer to this question is largely dependent on kind of proximity and information. So if the kids are, obviously every kid in Parkland knows about this to one degree or another. There's no way to protect them. And you want them to hear it from you first, not second, third, fourth, or through after all the gossip. So I think up here in New England, we're far enough away that people might not be talking to their elementary school age kids about this. But any kid that's got any technological savvy is getting the information. You want to talk to them first. Now, I want to say, though, in the way we talk to kids, we used to, when I was younger, talk about the sex talk as though there was a single conversation about sex and that I would give you information and you would absorb the information and then we'd be done. Important conversations are a series of conversations. And so anything that is important for you to talk to your kids about, what you do, and this is our own offspring children, biological, adopted, foster, the kids that are the best friends of my kids, but also the kids that we work with. The way you have these conversations is that you begin the conversation, say very little, paragraphs are not necessary, sentences are, and speak to kids in ways which make it clear that you will listen to questions, that you let the child tell you how much they want to know and what they want to know. And that will produce a further conversation and a further conversation. So there's not a hard and fast rule. I think it has to do with what your children are going to know on their own. But I think we should be prepared that conversations about important issues are not single conversations, they are ongoing conversations. And that is true, that will be true throughout our lives.
From the opposite perspective, Betsy, what happens if people are not hearing about this or everyone's hearing about it, but not talking about it? Do we actually have an obligation to bring these types of issues to the fore, realizing that there are also these things called parents involved in this equation as well? But like, I mean, as Jewish institutions, like, is this something that we should be bringing, playing up front as well?
Okay, so my first response to that is you've used a magic word, which is the word parents. And we have spoken a great deal about teens and teens mobilizing. What we haven't spoken about enough is what's happening for parents who are terrified and trying to manage themselves. So do be aware that the parents in your communities are often more frightened and more panicked and more helicoptery than their kids may be, because adolescents have the wonderful ability to say, ah, that happened in Florida. I'm not in Florida. Even with something as horrendous as this. It happened in Columbine. I'm not in Columbine. So we do need to be attentive to parents. I think I would start the conversation much as I started our conversation here. Where's your head at? And let them take you where they want to go. I would not ignore it, but if somebody says, I've talked about it, my guess is that the kids in South Florida right now are feeling like, I don't want to talk about this anymore. Stop already. They have the right to stop, partly because we have to allow them to get back to being normal kids and to smiling and to laughing and to misbehaving and behaving. In answer to the question, Colleen's question, which is, I think that it's important, if kids come to you and want to talk to you, I don't think you have I don't feel personally that I have an option to say, your parents don't want me to talk to you about this, and so I'm not going to. But I'm willing to take that anger from the parents that I've done something they didn't like doing, didn't want me to do. I do think if a kid that if I think we raise it, and I think we wait and see what comes up.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to address this question specifically to Simon, who's had a bit of experience. Hopefully the mic is working. I think we've got it on. Taking a stand is often not popular. And by definition, the fight worth fighting is often going to have people who are not with you on that issue. So I have a particular question which is stated as, we are a modern Orthodox day school and we want to stage a meaningful walkout, but facing opposition from administration because of the politics involved. I don't think it's just a modern Orthodox question. I think the question of how do we make a protest or a statement that's inclusive of all political views? Is that even possible? Or what do you do in an organization that could be defined as trying to cater to a cross-section of the community when dealing with issues like these? So Simon, Young Today is a pluralist organization. I'm sure you deal with this quite a lot. I'll ask you to come in on that question. Thank you. Simon, come off mute.
Can everyone hear me?
Now we can, go.
Excellent. Sorry about the technical difficulties. Yeah, I would basically advise, while this may be frustrating for some, to take a step back and look at the bigger picture of what one may be advocating for, rather than looking for a particular narrow solution to the problem. The first, and I think foremost role of the social change movement is to educate people of what the problem is and that there is a problem. And I think there can be significant consensus in any institution who is willing, and here is my caveat, if it's an institution that is willing to have student voices be part of the dialogue of the culture of the institution. But if they are, and I hope that they are, that the bigger question of safety, the bigger issues to do with ensuring our well-being is something that I feel is not a debatable or particularly strongly debatable issue. The issue is actually much more where it becomes political is, well, what are we going to do about this thing? And what I've seen be so effective over the last couple of weeks in particular is less to do with when people stand up and talk about a very, very particular action that needs to be taken by a politician, that you need to vote X on Y, but is talking about, here's how we're feeling. This is what we feel is wrong. We don't feel that there is a place for guns in our schools. Whatever the broader issue is, that is something that I think you can build far more consensus among without getting to a policy-specific proposal in which there will inevitably be divisiveness.
Thank you. Some people have addressed this already, but I want to hit on it specifically. Melissa, maybe you can come in on this specifically, and that is the role that social media is actually playing today, especially in mobilizing young people today. And social media has its pros and its cons always, but I think now we're seeing the force for good coming out of it, and this generation is so proficient in social media. But I'm specifically interested here, and the question has come is, what obligation do educators and parents have to empower their kids to use social media in a safe way, or what are the boundaries here, or has that already bolted and like now the kids are just running the show anyway? But like, how is social media playing into all of this activism as you see it? And then I'm going to ask Sarah Lynn to respond in a similar way as to what role social media is playing in your activism today. So Melissa, thank you.
Sure. I mean, I think there's like the pros and cons of social media. So in the moment when everything was happening and, my office staff starts calling everyone, I have this moment, like the light bulb went off. I'm like, oh my gosh, I have all my kids on Snapchat. And I start looking at their stories, because if they had posted in the last 15, 20 minutes, then I knew they were okay. And in that way, it's very helpful, because you see the teens start to mark themselves as okay. I mean, Sarah Lynn knows better than me. I'm not her age anymore, but they're not all on Facebook. They're on Snapchat, they're on Instagram, and they're receiving text messages. And that in the moment was super helpful. That's how they stayed in touch with all their parents. But it's also really horrible when the Snapchat videos go viral of someone sort of recording what's going on in their classroom by peeking out a closet or looking out the window, and then everyone's traumatized by watching exactly what the teens were witnessing in the moment. And lots of teens and younger kids saw those videos, and parents, and you can't unsee something once you've seen it. And I've had parents and teens say, hey, do you want to see it? No, I don't want to see it. I'm good. I have a rational understanding of what happened. I don't necessarily want the visual in my head as well. So, but on the flip side, especially when I went to go meet with the Broward County Teachers Labor Union, and they brought in someone from Columbine and someone from Sandy Hook and Newtown, and it was so powerful, right? Because here are two people who have already gone through this and came out on the other side and can talk about what went well in their aftermath and what they didn't do well. And one piece that kept coming up over and over again was the social media piece, because I think the main way that we'll be able to move the needle and change is that this happened in a high school with high school students. They do not need CNN and MSNBC per se. Yes, it helps amplify the message, but they all have this, and lots of people are following them. And if you look at the people who are online on the news stations right now, and you look at their Twitter handles, and again, Sarah Lynn, I don't know how long you've had yours, but all those teens that you keep seeing over and over in the media, you'll see that their Twitter handles were created in February 2018. They just started them 2 weeks ago and have hundreds of thousands of followers, and their messages have greater reverberations and greater ripples because they have access directly to you, directly to us, directly to everybody, directly to people in government. They don't need the intermediaries anymore. And any parent knows that when we were growing up, if we wanted to talk to our friends from youth group or we had middle management, and that was called your mom or dad who picked up the phone. Like here, there's no middle management in the social media situation, and there's one-to-one communication, and the message is loud and clear. So I think in that way, all these students who are using activism as a way to make change, as a way to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else, as a way for their healing, are going to be able to do that. And they are doing that. That's how you see every rally starting and every march starting, the March for Our Lives in every town. This is a grassroots teen-led movement. And from where I sit, it's not my job to get in the teens' way. It is my job to help facilitate what they want to do. And those teens you've seen on CNN, I've been looking at them for the last 4 years, growing up through middle school, and I couldn't be more proud when I see them talking and doing and acting. And if we're the people who call the bus company to organize the bus to Tallahassee, like, that's great. Let them do the rest. If we're the people who helps get the financial resources so no one needs to pay for them to go to DC, that's amazing. They will do the rest. And teens are smart and sophisticated and savvy. They always were, but now there's this whole new platform that's just making their message spread even wider and even greater.
Sarah Lynn, do you want to comment on the role of social media in your activism?
Yes, definitely. So I just wanted to say that if it weren't for social media, and that has nothing to do with Parkland, that is just plain and simple the way that this generation works. Like I said before, social media through BBYO gave me a platform to speak out for the things that I believed in, for the things that I so often stood up for. So like Rabbi Melissa said, some of these kids have only had their social media handles since the shooting happened, but there are others who have had social media and have turned their social worlds completely around to meet the needs of what this horror has left us to deal with. So my take on social media is, I come from New York Jewish parents who, they hate anything that has to do with my phone. They think that's the reason I have headaches, the reason that I get distracted from my homework. But recently, they are beyond grateful that I had my phone, because I was the first to hear at 2:24, after the first gunshots went off, that, something was happening. I pulled out of class. I texted all my friends I could think of that went there. I Snapchatted, I texted. And so once again, like Rabbi Melissa said, it is a great thing. It keeps you in the know. It keeps you informed. But at the same time, like the question that was posed, there are things that are horrible that are posted on social media. I mean, personally, I use Facebook as my main platform to get my messages across, because that's where I have the most friends and that's where I reach the biggest platform. But scrolling through Facebook in the last 2 weeks, there have been some heinous things going on, but there have also been some really amazing things. So I think it's kind of hard to kind of, decide how much of a role social media can play in this, like I said, movement. But we need to look at the fact that this movement started because of social media. Without social media, there wouldn't be a movement at all. So,
okay, thank you, Sarah Lynn. So I'm not sure there's an answer to this question, but I'm going to pose it as a problem that quite a few people have asked in some variation or another. And that is, what occurs when there's a conflict of values taking place? And the examples being asked about, what do we do with the fact that the March for Our Lives is taking place on Shabbat? Or what do we do when one of the demonstrations is taking place with a group that also has some other policies about Israel, for example, which we're ambivalent about? And who are our partners in this struggle, and how do we deal with the world that's not black and white here, and it's got so many different shades that adds such complexity as to who we work with. I think we'd all agree that this is not the Jews. This is not a Jewish struggle. This is an American or even a universal struggle. But what happens when your Jewish values come into conflict or come out in struggle with these other pieces? So maybe Simon, you can chime in first on this. Sarah Lynn, if you just go on mute, that'd be great.
Certainly, I think that there are two levels to answer the question at. The first is, from the Jewish perspective, is this even on the radar? Is the question even on the radar of many of our teams? In other words, where is the Jewish identity vis-a-vis their multiple identities? And is the question a question that we're posing as educators, or is this a question that they're necessarily posing themselves? And the reason I ask the question is it will depend very much on the way in which I personally would guide or answer a particular teen in that question. This is a question of community organizing. Saul Alinsky used to say that there are no permanent friends and no permanent enemies. You find your allies for the moment and you deal with it that way. That's one viewpoint, one political viewpoint of how do you deal with people who in other circumstances you may strongly disagree with, but you find yourself in alliance with on the streets on a particular issue. There are many ways to look at that. There are other perspectives, and sharing those perspectives with team leaders and helping them think through the different perspectives and where they stand in this would be, I would say, a fundamental role that a Jewish educator can play. In other words, guiding them to be intentional in how they're answering that question rather than doing it by chance or not thinking through what those potential outcomes may be if they choose a particular direction. The second layer on this is that there are resources that are available to help you guide this very, very challenging question. I would say in many of our communities, there are very, very effective Jewish community relations professionals, be it at JCRCs, JCPs, ADLs, and other organizations of the like, that can help guide some of those questions in terms of ways in which institutions have grappled with this in the past. Again, it would depend on whether a teen is asking this as an individual or whether a teen is saying this because they're mobilizing an entire Jewish organization to work in this particular way. I hope that may not answer the question, but hopefully poses the way in which we should be guiding the teens throughout this question.
And I can't even begin to reflect upon all of the different comments that are coming up in the chat about what different organizations are doing now and have done in the past. And please feel free to add your comments. There are Jewish responses coming from all different angles. We're not prescribing anything here at all. We are suggesting, though, that this is a movement which is active and we can't control it, even if we wanted to. And therefore, what are we doing and thinking about to actually empower these youth to take that stand? That being said, there are real techniques and skills that we want to offer both briefly now, but as resources afterwards about how do you create a safe space around these tough topics? What is the skill set that educators actually need to be able to have complicated conversations? I mean, this is not simple, and this is not in the job description of the average youth group advisor. And we are not suggesting that this is easy. And that being said, look inside your congregations and ask yourself, or your communal institutions or your schools, who are the mentors that can serve for these young people today? And being a mentor is very different to being a teacher or being a consultant. But actually, listening to the questions that these youth professionals in whatever stripe are asking is a very, very important role. And that might be part of our new job description, both to the youth educators and also to the teens themselves, to see ourselves as mentors rather than having all of the answers to all of these questions is very, very important. If there's any advice that we can offer on how do we create a safe space for teens to have these conversations, I think that'd be welcomed at this point in the conversation. Melissa, are there any tips that you would be giving to what's the safe space, or as one of my colleagues calls it, the brave space for people to be able to talk about these types of issues?
I mean, I really looked at my role in the past 2 weeks as facilitator. I certainly don't have all the answers, and no one ever gave me a manual on how to deal with what I'm dealing with right now. And, you know, I'm a rabbi who has an education degree and a social work degree, and I still feel very, what's the word I'm looking for? This is because I'm so sleep deprived. I feel like I'm insufficient in helping my teens and helping the families. But what I am good at, which everyone needs to be good at, is asking for help and support and knowing who the right people are to talk to help you create the space to assist you in doing the work. So for example, I knew pretty much right away I would need to call Betsy, who was my teacher and an educator I worked with when I ran a different education program, because she would help guide me. I knew on Wednesday, after we knew all the children were safe, I sat down and I said, okay, who are all the mental health professionals in our congregation that we can mobilize to ask them to start coming to do group work here and facilitate these conversations? Who's in private practice that can bring some people with them? And that's what we did. And again, there was no manual. No one told us how to do this. As things went on and life kept evolving, we started to figure out, okay, what does our youth director need also for support? And she's amazing, and she's hanging with the kids all the time and texting and calling. You know, what do we need in our youth lounge to help make it a safe space? So I had a director of a teen leadership camp, Melissa Frey from Kutz's Camp. She came here and looked at our youth lounge and said, these are the things you need. So, you know, if you do nothing to help prepare, make yourself, whether mentally or on a piece of paper and on your computer, a list of, if something were to happen, who are your people, the people that you need in your corner to help you get through what you need to get through. Because you don't know what you need until you need it, and every minute it's changing. But at least I know who my best resources are to make it happen. And that was like the best thing that happened for us. And just to be open and around and available speaks volumes. If you look at my Facebook page, a lot of my posts are public right now, and it just has a lot of, come here, we're hanging out. And some days no one takes advantage of our mental health counselors. And some days there's like a waiting room in our lobby. Sometimes it's younger kids coming with parents just because they need assistance of how to explain, you know, how do I tell my child what happened on that day? I'm uncomfortable doing it. Sometimes I've had these people during religious school hours, and I've had kids come in, like 4th graders, 3rd graders, saying, can I talk to someone? My mommy hasn't stopped crying for like 4 or 5 days and she won't get off the couch. Like real stuff happening to real people. So you want to make sure you have the space available for people, and you want to make sure it's sacred and it's safe. And I don't mean safe. The word safe for me has taken on all new meaning, but I mean emotionally safe. And as my senior rabbi said the other day, we are sacred first responders, right? I'm not on the scene, but I'm next to the scene, and I'm holding stories. Every morning I wake up, I'm like, I need to empty out because everyone's going to fill me up with their stories. And at the end of the day, I need to figure out where to let it all out again so I can be an empty vessel the next day for everyone to fill me up.
Melissa, thank you. I'm going to ask each of our other panelists now to finish off with 1 or 2 sentences that they would leave as a charge to this audience moving forward. So, Betsy.
First, I want to thank all of you for being here, and I want to thank David for arranging this. The creation of a safe space happens over time, and there are lots of kids who are now coming to Kol Tikva who wouldn't have come before, and some of them won't come back. The creation of a safe space happens in space, but it happens much more in relationship. One of the things that we know about teenagers today is that they have lots of friendships, but fewer real relationships. And part of what our job is, as people who love teenagers and people who work with teenagers, is to create opportunities for teenagers to have substantive, real relationships. That's not to have depth in their conversation. If you have kids with whom you have created any depth, you have created safety. You have created, as David says, bravery. And I think that it speaks to the importance of having created a net for people. Your net is not the people that you play with, it's the people you're real with. And we have opportunities to be real with kids and to give them the opportunity to be real with us. That's really, really important. It's an essential part of making adults.
Thank you, Betsy. Simon, do you want to give a final couple of sentences here?
Yeah, I actually want to juxtapose what Melissa and Betsy have so beautifully stated already, which is really looking after yourself, being the burnout, needing support, etc. The juxtaposition I'd like to make is, in fact, as someone who thankfully is slightly more removed from a community that is in such pain, I'm actually feeling an incredible sense of inspiration and meaning in the work that I'm doing, feeling actually quite blessed to have the ability to provide for community and love and support for people, to provide meaning through values, providing lifelong tools of citizenship and change that we see our teens are now embracing and changing the world in, and a certain sense of hope that we can bring, which is really why many of us came into the work that we're doing now. And so out of real tragedy and horrific situations, there really is the hope that we as a Jewish community are trying to build among our participants, among our community members, among our teens. And it's an incredible honor to be part of this period of our lives.
Thank you. And of course, to Sarah Lynn now, what would you like to leave us with?
I just want to finish by saying that this is the most inspiring thing that I've taken part of in the last 2 weeks, and the fact that this is with strictly adults instead of teenagers is something that I can't even put into words. So I just want to finish by saying thank you, and I just wanted to say, you know, this is going to take time. That's the hardest thing for people my age to understand, and especially when time doesn't seem like it's of the essence now. You know, our lives, it could be the last day, but we will change this if we work together and we stay strong. The only way that we will make a change is by showing our resilience, and together, that's what we need to focus on. So thank you all so much.
Sarah Lynn, thank you very much. And to everybody, I do want to have a few concluding words here for this webinar to help bring us to a close, and to acknowledge that there have been over 300 people on this call today. And many more will look at this on Facebook Live, and also on the video that will come out afterwards of this webinar. This was not done alone. I do want to thank all of the organisations that really came on board to co-sponsor this event. I want to mention them all by name. You can see their logos there, but we're in this together, and we truly, truly appreciate everybody coming together to do this holy work. I do want to mention that now I'm getting a bit, sorry, that next week there will be another webinar that we are proud to be co-sponsoring with our partners, with the Association for Reformed Jewish Educators at the URJ, talking a bit more about how do we get down into the more practical skills of what we're talking about, dealing with youth workers, and encourage people. There'll be information about this that we will disseminate afterwards for all of you to participate in this upcoming second webinar on this particular topic. I do want to say also that this doesn't stop here. To acknowledge what I said in the beginning, this is just a webinar. But what else can we be doing? Support your kids, help your kids. But I want to just raise one other issue. Raise the voice of your teenagers. They are coming to the fore and they are speaking now articulately and passionately. But what else can you be doing? And I urge you all, for every Jewish organization out there, include a teen voice in your next board meeting. At your conferences, make sure you involve a teenager in not just a sideshow, but really taking the main stage to be able to deliver their messenger to everybody. They are frequent and they are more ubiquitous than just Sarah Lynn, who did a wonderful job representing all of the Jewish teenagers today. But they are there in all of your communities. For those of you who are in synagogue life, one of the things that people have asked you is, what can we do on March 24th on the Shabbat when there is Day of Action? We are asking, are you as rabbis and clergy prepared to cede some of your time on the bimah, to give those teens a voice, to actually give their message on that day to your congregations? But at any time or any opportunity that you might have, please elevate the voice of your teenagers, because this is probably the quote which for me sums it all up, by Janusz Korczak, and I mentioned this in the article that we wrote recently. Unfortunately, Janusz Korczak is known too often or too well just for the way he died, but in his life, he also delivered very, very important messages. Children are not the people of tomorrow, but a people of today. They have a right to be taken seriously and to be treated with tenderness and respect. They should be allowed to grow into whoever they were meant to be. The unknown person inside each of them is our hope for the future. And I think that's the message that we should all leave ourselves with. To note that these resources are readily available for all of you to access. We'll be sending them out in a follow-up email to all of you tomorrow. But really, to all of you, thank you for taking the time in your day to reflect. What happened 2 weeks ago should never happen again. But that all of us can come together as a community online, offer each other support, skills, knowledge, and workshop this together to be able to help each other in such times. And then most importantly now also, to really be there for our teens as they really do strive to change the world. Thank you all very much. Looking forward to speaking with you all of you again in better times. And thanks to all of our panelists.